The most brutal twist? The man who helped him search the house was helping his enemies find him too. Everybody thinks the big shock is the hidden bunker, or the $40 million, or the proof that Griffin's grandfather was murdered. Nope. The real knife twist is Perry, the loyal bodyguard, the man Griffin raised, trusted, and kept closest. While Griffin is down there uncovering the truth of his bloodline, Perry is upstairs selling him out in real time. That is what makes this story hurt, because Griffin wasn't just fighting a family enemy. He was standing in the middle of a house full of ghosts, not realizing one of them was still alive.
When a barrier is breached, what emerges is not masonry dust, but the suffocating evidence of a 30-year deception. This presents Subject 1. Griffin Calloway, age 36, a latent apex predator within the criminal ecosystem. He manipulates the East Coast's underworld from a veneer of legitimacy, an autonomous monarch. The sole figure he deferred to was his progenitor, Henry, the dynasty's architect. Yet Henry has been absent for 3 decades, officially due to cardiac arrest, a diagnosis Griffin consistently rejected. Thus, when the family estate defaults for a trivial $120,000, he reacquires it with clinical resolve. His objective was not real estate acquisition. It was to excavate a crypt he believed held the forensic truth of his grandfather's end. The unforeseen variable? A female subject was sheltering within. Subject 2 is Lowen Price, age 27, a transient individual residing in a damaged vehicle, an architect of considerable promise whose career was truncated by her mother's medical expenses. For weeks, the edifice had been her refuge, its hidden history her sole companion. Consequently, when Griffin's operative discovers her and presents a firearm, she exhibits a profound lack of autonomic response. She meets the gaze of the coast's most dominant male with a disquieting stillness that arrests his subordinate's trained reflex. That single static moment altered their trajectories, as her diagnostic architectural acumen held the coordinates to a concealed truth. $40 million and a revelation that would destabilize his entire psychological framework. Griffin signals his operative, Perry, to stand down, but the weapon remains fixed on Lowen, his subordinate's finger poised on the trigger, awaiting the command to neutralize the anomaly. Perry vocalizes the risk assessment. She is a witness who has registered their identities and location, but Griffin is wholly fixated on Lowen. There is no pleading, no verbal self-preservation attempt. He has cataloged all manifestations of fear. The supplication of the weak, the convoluted fabrications of the treacherous. Lowen's silence represents a novel behavioral data point. It is not the passivity of surrender, but the inert state of a psyche that has reached its nadir and exhausted its capacity for fear. She remains, Griffin dictates, his tone low. Perry initiates a protest, but a simple dorsal turn from Griffin terminates the exchange. In their subculture, a leader turning his back is a non-negotiable directive. It is then Lowen vocalizes, "I do not take charity." Griffin pauses, his posture unchanged. "This is not an offer of such," he states. "You comprehend this framework. I require your expertise to prevent its collapse. Your labor in exchange for my protection. That is our arrangement." In that moment, a pact was formed, predicated not on rapport, but on a shared, unyielding pride. That evening, as Perry and 2 of Griffin's assets established a perimeter downstairs, Lowen retreated to her designated space on the 2nd story. Her material possessions consisted of a blanket, a water bottle, and a sketchbook she protected as if it were a talisman. At night, the mansion's atmosphere became psychologically oppressive. The wind vocalized through its structure, and the stairs groaned, the building itself projecting the image of a massive, expiring organism. The pervasive scent of decomposition suggests a terminal diagnosis for the structure. infiltrating all organic matter. Furnishings, shrouded in sterile white sheets, resemble subjects in a suspended animation study. The subject Griffin exhibits symptoms of acute insomnia. His nocturnal patrols, illuminated by a single beam, scan the cellular decay of the walls, epidermal wallpaper peeling from scarred plaster where portraits were excised. A neurological interrupt occurs. A single oxidized nail presents the primary stimulus, a photograph obscured by a film of accumulated organic detritus. The subject initiates decontamination of the artifact's glass plate, revealing a latent image. The figure identified as Henry, the subject's grandfather, displaying indicators of high social status. A male child, aged approximately 5 to 6, exhibits signs of positive affection towards the elder. This child is the subject himself. He displays a catatonic response, his digits making contact with the barrier, attempting to breach a 30-year temporal and emotional gap. The artifact serves as a key diagnostic tool explaining the elder's compulsive retreat to this site of advanced decay. The subsequent 3 days yield only particulate matter. Griffin's 4-man unit systematically dismantles the house, from the subterranean darkness of the cellar to the hypoxic attic. They force open sealed cabinets and fracture antique woodwork, finding nothing. It seemed the familial folklore was accurate. Henry had liquidated his assets before his death, squandering his capital on failed ventures that left him destitute. The accepted history was that he died, impoverished, and isolated in a squalid motel. Perry, Griffin's second, reiterates his pragmatic doubts. "There is nothing here, Chief. We are pursuing phantoms." But Griffin's fixation remained absolute. While his men performed a destructive search, Lowen operated on a separate cognitive level upstairs. She moved through the rooms with her sketchbook, sounding walls and analyzing beams in a quiet structural forensic analysis. She maintained her distance from the men, a psychological boundary none of them ventured to cross. That boundary was violated on 2 occasions. The first occurred at 200 hours on their second night. Chronic insomnia, a conditioned response from being a 17-year-old urban survivor where deep sleep was a lethal liability, drove Griffin into the upper-level darkness. He observed a light source from beneath the door and entered without warning. He found Lowen on the floor, working by candlelight. Her graphite pencil moved across the paper with a surgeon's exactitude. Griffin observed the sketchbook, and the reality of the situation became clear. This was not mere illustration. It was a flawless architectural rendering of the floor plan, charting every concealed conduit and support, generated entirely from eidetic memory. Lowen simply met his gaze without fear, without defensiveness. For a second, Griffin no longer perceived a transient, but a master artisan discarded by society. He departed without speaking, the schematic imprinted on his mind. The second violation transpired the next day. While assessing a compromised ceiling, Lowen overheard Griffin on a call in the adjacent room. His vocal tone was not the detached manner of her benefactor. This voice was glacial, each word a calibrated weapon. He was stating, "Inform Vance his rationalizations are irrelevant. A debt is owed. His deadline is Friday. If my capital is not returned by Saturday, his financial difficulties and all his other difficulties will be permanently resolved." Lowen remained immobile, experiencing for the first time a chill unrelated to the decaying structure. The fear that registered within her was not for her own safety. Self-preservation was a dormant instinct. It was the stark comprehension that the man providing her sanctuary, the man who observed her work by candlelight, could terminate a life with that same clinical detachment. She stayed, but now perceived the gulf between them not as mere distance, but as a void she could not possibly traverse. That afternoon, as Griffin analyzed old schematics, Perry received a call and moved to the veranda. He registered the caller, ID, a moment of ambivalence crossing his features, then relocated to the side of the house where the masonry would obscure his voice. He spoke in a low tone, his back to the structure. Griffin looked up from the plans as Perry concluded the communication and turned. For a brief interval, their eyes met. Perry offered no report. Griffin made no inquiry. But within that silent exchange, a fissure developed in their dynamic. On her fourth day, Lowen knocked on the door of Griffin's first-floor room. An unprecedented action. Her expression was fractured, a significant deviation from her standard composure. The quiet resilience had been supplanted by a meticulously contained panic, as if she had witnessed an impossibility. "You must observe this," she stated. "Upstairs, a door was obstructed. I forced it." Griffin ascended the stairs after her, Perry following closely. The room was situated at the terminus of the second-floor east wing. A substantial oak door was splintered from its jamb, a pry bar discarded nearby. The instant Griffin crossed the threshold, he understood precisely why she had summoned him. The room was once a study. To label it a former study was an extreme understatement. Whatever its function 3 decades prior, it was now a detonation site. Books had been systematically vivisected, their spines broken, their pages forming a dense paper stratum across the floor. The shelving was shattered, like a mandible with half its teeth removed. This was not chaotic vandalism, it was methodical, a volume-by-volume search, as if an unknown party was hunting for something within the text itself. They had been unsuccessful because their objective was never the text. It was the desk. A monolithic walnut desk stood beneath a sealed window, supporting a stack of derelict ledgers. When Griffin placed a hand on one, he left a clean impression in the accumulated filth. He displaced the dust and opened the cover. It was his grandfather Henry's script. Faded, yet still icily exact and clear. This was no diary. It was the procurement manifest for a hardened facility. March 7th, 4,000 pounds of steel I-beams, delivered at 2 a.m. April 12th, 2 industrial-grade diesel generators, acquired via cash transaction. August 9th, a custom ventilation system installed. The final entry was a clinical note. Contractor exhibited excessive curiosity. Contract terminated. Griffin turned page after fragile page, his expression solidifying into an unreadable mask. The ledger chronicled a 5-year covert war from 1988 to 93, securing millions in military-grade assets. Steel, power systems, blast doors. His grandfather had constructed a bunker, while the family dismissed him as senile. Griffin's focus lifted, scanning the study's wreckage beyond the corridor, down to the very foundation. For 3 days, the structure had withheld its secrets. The scene presented an absolute void. No trace of steel supports, no hum from a power system, just the faint signs of decay in old vents. 2 tons of steel, industrial generators, and masses of concrete had been erased from existence. Lowen observed from the doorway a static presence. She understood that with a subject like Griffin, immobility was the required stimulus for communication. Perry approached, his dismissive gaze at the journal over Griffin's shoulder projecting a clear diagnosis. The elder Calloway was delusional, a subject who amasses a cache of equipment only to allow its decay. A textbook case of grandiose pathology. Griffin displayed no effect. He advanced the final page. The penmanship had degraded. The organized script had devolved into a frantic, aggressive scrawl, the graphic representation of a mind under extreme duress. "They are coming. The hounds are loose. The gallery is sealed." Amid the terror, a coping strategy emerged. "Let them believe I'm mad. Let them believe I'm ruined." Then, the key. "The hollow wall contains the truth." Griffin processed the text twice, his tactile exploration of the script an attempt to connect with the 30-year-old fear state. In that moment, the entire case history fractured and reformed. Henry Calloway was not psychotic. His paranoia was not a delusion. He had constructed something within the building's core framework, a secret demanding 2 tons of steel and a self-sufficient power source for its preservation. Its concealment was so effective it had evaded detection for 3 decades. He was in flight from an unidentified persecutor. Who were they? What were the hounds? And within this deteriorating structure, where was the hollow wall? Griffin closed the ledger with the caution reserved for a live ordnance. His gaze met Lowen's, his intellectual curiosity, now a palpable, somatic drive. "You have been surveying this location for weeks," he stated. "Any structural anomalies, a wall of excessive thickness, a negative space where none should exist?" Lowen hesitated. Her focus shifted between his expression, the journal, and back. "Not as of yet," she replied. "But I now have a precise search image." The following morning, Griffin stood on his porch with his coffee and registered the sound of tires on gravel. The auditory input was anomalous. The path to Thornfield was so deteriorated that vehicles had to proceed at a crawl. This was a smooth, dominant approach, the sound of a machine for which terrain is irrelevant. A black Bentley Continental materialized, its polished surface mirroring the trees as it progressed down the ruined lane, a precious object in a derelict environment. The car halted. The chauffeur exited to open the passenger door. A male subject, approximately 62 years of age, emerged. His silver hair was a perfectly coiffed, solid unit. A bespoke gray 3-piece suit was tailored to his physique. He displayed contempt for the mud en route to the porch. However, the primary stimulus Griffin registered was not the attire or the vehicle. It was his smile. It was broad and confident, a performative display of warmth limited to the mouth. His eyes remained cold, and they surveyed the mansion with an expression Griffin recognized from his own reflection, the expression of appropriation. "Griffin Calloway," the subject stated, his voice tonally smooth, offering a business card of such density it felt like a small tile. "Warren Ashford of Ashford and Crane. I have been developing this valley for 30 years. This property has long been a target of interest." Griffin accepted the card without looking at it, merely holding it. "State your objective." "Direct, an admirable trait." Warren entered the porch, his eyes continuing their visual consumption of the mansion. "My information indicates you recently took possession of Thornfield, and that you settled over $120,000 in tax arrears to do so. Mr. Calloway, this property is a financial liability. The roof is compromised, the foundation is failing, and the electrical system is an antique. My interest is confined to the land. 12 acres with this vista. The potential is significant. I propose an offer of $2 million, cash. Your signature would yield a 15-fold return on your investment in under a week. A clean transaction for all parties." Griffin consumed his coffee. $2 million was a derisory figure, less than a quarterly gain from one of his smaller ventures. But he made no verbal response. he simply observed. In his operational environment, where a single misspoken word could be fatal, silence is a method of interrogation. A subject, when confronted with a conversational void, will inevitably overdisclose. And in his subsequent sentence, Warren Ashford revealed his entire psychological state. Frankly, the structure is a loss anyway, Warren said, his tone slick, but his gaze flickered to the foundation for a fraction of a second. A neurotypical individual would not have perceived it. Griffin was not neurotypical. It is unfortunate, but the sub-basement experienced a significant inundation back in the 1990s. The entire foundation is unstable. It would require heavy machinery just to stabilize the ground before new construction could begin. Griffin's facial expression remained neutral. Internally, a cold hypothesis was forming. He had reviewed the original architectural plans the previous night. Lowen had dedicated 3 weeks to documenting every facet of the house. No sub-basement was indicated on any plan. The structure was built on soft, low-grade soil. Such an excavation would have been structurally catastrophic. No flood had occurred. The foundation was sound. Warren Ashford was fabricating a narrative, a confabulation centered on a single objective: the unoccupied space beneath the house. The precise location where 2 tons of steel and 2 industrial generators disappeared 3 decades prior. He possessed the knowledge. This subject knew what was concealed there, and he had arrived to claim it. "I will take it under advisement," Griffin replied, his voice devoid of inflection, revealing nothing, even to Perry. Warren paused, and for the first time the social mask faltered. The performance ceased, exposing the predator beneath the expensive tailoring. "Do not treat me as an inferior, Calloway." Warren's vocal pitch lowered, becoming harsh and guttural. "Your grandfather attempted that strategy, and we are all aware of that outcome." He pivoted, went down the stairs, and entered his vehicle. The Bentley accelerated away, absorbed by the forest. Griffin remained, his coffee now cold and forgotten. Perry moved to his position. "Give the order, boss." But Griffin was non-responsive. He was processing Warren's final statement. A terrifying disclosure. "Your grandfather attempted that strategy." This was not a threat. It was the ego-driven admission of a man confessing to homicide. Warren Ashford knew the exact circumstances of Henry Calloway's death because his family had orchestrated it. For 30 years, this suspicion had been a chronic, low-level stressor in Griffin's psyche. Now, standing on the porch where his grandfather had held him as a boy, the stressor had been identified. That evening, a storm manifested with dramatic intensity. The atmosphere had been oppressive, and by 8, the sky resembled a dark contusion. Thunder detonated like ordnance, and rain descended in a solid acoustic wall against the compromised roof. The mansion vocalized under the assault, the terminal sounds of a wounded organism. Wind shrieked through boarded-up windows with a human-like quality. On an upper floor, a door began to slam repeatedly, a frantic, cyclical percussion, the cardiac arrhythmia of a structure in its final throes. Perry and his associates attempted to rest on the ground floor. Griffin did not. He sat among the study's debris, his grandfather's journal open, his flashlight beam focused on one clear, articulate sentence. "The hollow wall will keep the truth." He sensed her presence before the visual confirmation. Lowen appeared in the doorway, her hair damp from a leak, clutching a sketchbook as a defensive object. "I am unable to sleep," she stated, a quiet acknowledgement of their shared state of vigilance. Griffin offered neither recognition nor rejection. She entered, sat on the floor, and leaned against a desk. They remained in silence, enclosed by the storm's acoustic violence. Two subjects in a fractured environment, experiencing a silence more profound than any verbal exchange. Then Griffin vocalized, his tone a low frequency against the storm. My grandfather converted this house into a strong box. 2 tons of steel, large generators. He knew he was being hunted, and it was insufficient. He paused. A subject presented himself today. He desired the house. He fabricated a narrative about the foundation, and then he spoke of my grandfather with the certainty of one who understands how to terminate a life. He provided no names, no history of the 30-year conflict. He disclosed only the critical data for her to comprehend the situation's severity. This was not a dispute over real estate. It was a tomb, and an intruder was attempting to desecrate it before Griffin could excavate the secret his grandfather had interred. Lowen processed the information, then opened her sketchbook. The concealed void, she verbalized softly, it must exist. It was a declaration of fact, not an inquiry. If he integrated it into the structural framework of this house, she continued, indicating a diagram of the upper level, I will locate its boundaries, but I require new measurements. She rose, already holding the measuring tape, and moved into the hall. Griffin followed her. Lowen extended the tape along the corridor's entire axis, securing it tautly 45 feet. She then entered the study, a room adjacent to the hall, and measured its interior wall. 39 feet. She made direct eye contact with him. 6 feet, she announced. There is a 6-foot void between this room and the hallway. She proceeded to the north wall, which was obscured by a large bookshelf, and percussed its frame, then the wall beside it. The acoustic feedback was markedly different. This is not merely a piece of furniture, she stated. It is a built-in feature. This entire assembly is integral to the house's structure. That is only done when the intent is to conceal the wall itself. Behind this bookcase is a 6-foot space that is absent from all architectural plans. Griffin's gaze shifted from the massive shelving unit to the sledgehammer he had procured, now resting in a corner. The bookcase was an exquisite antique fixture, perhaps the last object of aesthetic value left in the entire dilapidated manor. A cognitive schism afflicted the subject, a non-productive rage fixated upon the imago of Warren Ashford. An auditory memory, the antagonist's taunt, served as the final trigger for action. Griffin then acquired the sledgehammer, its tangible mass counteracting his psychic turmoil. The primary impact produced an acute acoustic event, eradicating the room's ambient silence. A chaotic dispersal of wood fragments followed. Through subsequent frantic blows, he breached the partition, his physical exhaustion overridden until a visual stimulus from the past emerged, a remnant of faded floral wallpaper. The tool head breached the plaster, releasing a noxious plume of hermetically sealed air. A crowbar was then utilized, its applied leverage inducing the sound of metallic fixtures under stress. A novel olfactory input was then detected, not the expected scent of decay, but a cold, sterile atmosphere. This was characteristic of a space sealed for 3 decades. Through suspended particulates, Griffin aimed his light into the new cavity, a portal to a perfectly preserved environmental timeline. His illumination revealed not deterioration, but a state of flawlessness. A heavy steel door, devoid of any markings, was perceived to be open by a mere inch. Beyond it, a helical iron staircase descended into a void of total light absorption. His companion Lowen presented with a countenance of pure astonishment while observing the abyss. An external thunderclap punctuated their observational silence. The subjects were positioned before a void Henry Calloway had constructed 30 years before, a space engineered for this exact discovery. As Griffin traversed the threshold, a profound thermal drop emanated from the initial step. The staircase, undisturbed for 3 decades, exhibited no structural degradation. It was absolutely sound, as if temporally isolated. The subject's light source was wholly consumed by the blackness. Lowen materialized behind him, her declaration, "I'm coming with you," stated as an incontrovertible fact. The subject offered no counter-response. The descent constituted a passage through progressively intensifying states of isolation. At 10 steps, the air shifted from stale to the sterile chill of a sealed chamber. At 20 steps, the masonry transitioned to smooth, cold bedrock. The 80-step spiral concluded on a concrete landing. There, Griffin confronted a physical manifestation of a myth. A blast door. This was clearly not a cellar, but a Cold War artifact, engineered from solid steel to withstand a terminal event. A thin, dark seam indicated the door was unlatched. Griffin applied his full body mass to the crowbar. The hinges emitted a high-frequency acoustic response that resonated up the stairwell. The door yielded, revealing a perfect, lightless vacuum within. The subject's light beam penetrated the darkness, exposing colossal forms. In a corner stood a large olive-drab machine, its exhaust apparatus routed directly into the ceiling. The apparatus was identified as the Caterpillar diesel generator from the ledger, shielded with lead and procured through non-standard channels. Adjacent to it stood a gray electrical panel, its main switch in the off position. From this unit, heavy-gauge cables extended from the generator across the ceiling like metallic dendrites. Griffin approached the panel, a device left inert for 30 years. He grasped the breaker, regulated his breathing, and engaged it. The subsequent second of profound silence was punctuated only by his own cardiac rhythm and Lowen's sharp inhalation. A low-frequency hum initiated, a vibration that propagated from the floor into his skeletal system. The Caterpillar engine cycled twice before igniting with a deafening report, the sound of a dormant system reactivating after a 30-year interval. The overhead lights engaged sequentially. Click, click, click. Each unit emitted a hum of latent energy. A sterile white light flooded the space, revealing its immense scale. Griffin's flashlight fell from his hand. He was located inside a massive subterranean vault, a tomb of concrete and steel. The ceiling exceeded a height of 10 feet, covering a floor of immaculate polished concrete. A low vibration from the walls suggested an active ventilation system, still functional after 3 decades circulating cool, arid air. A mahogany conference table occupied the center, a dissonant element of civility in the subterranean environment. Against a wall stood 6 Mosler safes of formidable construction. However, the far wall commanded his focus. A vast corkboard cupboard in a complex collage of documents connected by a web of red string. Each line represented a documented link in the complex network of paranoid ideation Henry Calloway constructed during his final years of cognitive decline. Griffin's focus shifted, processing the entire environmental schema. The subject's grandfather was not indigent, nor clinically insane. His paranoia was a conditioned response to a verified external threat. Henry had liquidated his assets, converting them into this subterranean vault, a psychological time capsule engineered for a designated heir to uncover the ideological truth. As he approached the board, Griffin experienced a fracturing of his familial narrative. The focal point was a black and white photograph of 2 men before a known office building in Poughkeepsie. The younger subject was Warren Ashford, estimated age of 30, his hair not yet grayed. His smile was effectless, wide, but lacking genuine warmth. Beside him, an older male presented similar, severe facial structures and cold eyes. Below, a name was inscribed in Henry's red ink: Conrad Ashford. Red strings radiated from the photograph, like pathological vascular growth. Griffin traced their pathways. One led to copies of wire transfers from the Cayman Islands, documenting the extraction of hundreds of thousands from accounts belonging to Henry Calloway. The signatures were identified as crude forgeries. A second string led to contracts for asset liquidation, all bearing the same forged signature and channeled through a shell corporation that resolved after 4 layers to Ashford and Crane Holdings. The family's capital had not vanished. It was siphoned through systematic forgery during Henry's lifetime. A third string indicated a report on the Ashford Creek Dam, an Ashford and Crane project from 1987. An inspector's annotation noted that the contractor had compromised structural integrity for profit, creating a lethal concealed hazard. But the final string caused Griffin to seek physical support. It led to a thin medical file, its contents feeling disproportionately heavy. It contained Henry's blood analysis from a Connecticut lab dated 3 months prior to his death. The toxicology results indicated a lethal concentration of digitalis in Henry's system, not clinically administered. He had no cardiac condition, but introduced by an external agent. The substance induces cardiac arrhythmia, culminating in cardiac arrest. In the early 1990s, a standard autopsy would not detect such sophisticated poisoning, classifying the death as natural. Henry Calloway did not die of heart failure. He was the subject of a protracted, deliberate murder, a homicide he was aware of as it occurred. By the time he understood the methodology, his physiological state was too compromised for resistance, allowing him only to document the crime and construct this vault as a final contingency. Griffin remained unaware of his own tremors until Lowen's hand made contact with his shoulder. Her touch provided a grounding, tactile stimulus. He remained frozen, his knuckles white on the table, his respiration disrupted. In that moment, the subject underwent a profound emotional regression, re-experiencing the primary trauma of his grandfather's death. "They executed my grandfather," he vocalized, the statement sounding fragile in the space. This was a disclosure not for his companion, but for the environment itself, a release of 3 decades of suppressed information. He regained his composure and moved to the safes. 5 were seized by time, but the 6th and smallest was slightly open. Within was a pristine leather briefcase. An envelope lay on top, bearing familiar script. For the last of the Calloway line. With a trembling hand, Griffin broke the wax seal. The writing was Henry's, but imbued with a terminal, unyielding resolve. "Upon your reading this, I am deceased, and the predators are active. The toxic agent was administered by Conrad Ashford. My son, Marshall, possesses excessive faith and insufficient character to perceive the deception. The empire is not lost. I have merely concealed it. This case holds $40 million in pre-1982 bearer bonds, which are untraceable. Possession constitutes ownership. Alongside them is the microfiche, the only original record. It holds the medical reports, financial transfers, fraudulent contracts, the dam inspection, all data needed to destroy the Ashford legacy. They have searched for this for 30 years. They will come to this house." These post-mortem instructions were a testament to his paranoia. Griffin displayed the artifacts. $40 million in untraceable currency and one slide of incriminating film. Lowen's focus, however, was on him, not the assets. In the bunker's clinical lighting, 50 feet underground, their mutual gaze established a silent, unbreakable alliance. In that interval, their cognitive reality shattered. A crash from the surface, muffled by 30 steps of iron and layers of stone, signaled an external intrusion. The manor's main entrance had been breached. Griffin's survival instincts, honed over 2 decades, activated. He turned to an obsolete security console, a dormant monument to his grandfather's paranoia, and engaged a switch. The monitors activated, displaying the ghostly, low-resolution images from Henry's 30-year-old surveillance network. The central monitor presented a chilling tableau of the main hall. The subject, Warren Ashford, occupied its center, his precise attire a projection of control against the external chaos. He surveyed the space with the proprietary air of a ruler reclaiming a territory left dormant for 3 decades. He was accompanied by 2 dark-clad figures, while a third, a lithe man known as Bones, moved into the frame with the practiced efficiency of a predator. The moniker, Bones, was a known signifier of extreme violence on the East Coast. Floyd Keegan was Ashford's specialist in psychological and physical demolition. The 5th operative, however, induced a state of paralytic shock in Griffin. This man, Perry Langston, moved with a self-assurance that Griffin himself had cultivated, now standing in service to his actual master. His report was delivered in the affectless tone of their own mission parameters, exhibiting no signs of duress. He will target the old man's concealed assets. It is an inevitability. Ashford's responding nod was a slow, definitive gesture of termination. Locate him. Then you will neutralize him and all his intelligence. Fabricate a structural failure. Incinerate the property. The storm provides complete deniability. Griffin's focus shifted from the screen to an 18-year-old memory of discovering a vulnerable Perry in Boston. Griffin, only 3 years into his own authority, had misidentified desperation as loyalty, a catastrophic diagnostic error. He had extended absolute trust to Perry, a psychological currency the man had now liquidated. A covert communication from the terrace, previously dismissed as a minor anomaly, was now understood as a critical point of systemic failure. Griffin. Lowen's voice penetrated his dissociative state. We must egress immediately? She pulled him from his cognitive fixation, her pragmatism reinforcing the fact that inaction was functionally equivalent to death. On the monitor, the enforcer, Bones, began his ascent. A flashlight beam cut through the study's gloom, illuminating the void where a bookcase once stood. Griffin observed the precise instant of cognitive recognition. Bones pivoted, his guttural vocalization echoing down the stairwell. Subject is here! There is a sub-level access point! The sound of heavy footfalls above was followed by the metallic resonance of boots on the spiral staircase. The pursuit was active. Griffin secured the briefcase. Lowen, anticipating the protocol, concealed the microfiche case within her coat. He then engaged the generator's large, green-painted iron lever. Green key secures the egress. He applied his full body weight. A high-frequency alarm permeated the bunker, causing Lowen to cover her ears. A concealed steel plate deployed from above as the primary blast door sealed the lower passage, converting the stairs into a steel trap. A projectile sparked against the door, its ricochet a high-pitched whine through the hall as incandescent fragments descended. Griffin's instinct was to shield Lowen, a primal impulse to protect his sole remaining asset. the blast door ceased with a percussive impact. A sequence of heavy, echoing clicks signaled the engagement of the automated locking mechanisms. A profound silence followed, punctuated only by the muted, ineffective impacts from the other side. They remained in a defensive crouch, the acrid scent of propellant in the air. They were contained yet secure, sealed 50 feet underground in a concrete enclosure. As he assisted Lowen, the door's impact resonating through his own frame, he processed the new paradigm. The frantic sounds from outside were already attenuating, becoming as remote as ambient storm noise. Their pursuers were entrapped, but they were equally captive to the final phase of Henry's contingency plan. A red wheel initiates the secondary passage. Griffin moved swiftly to the bunker's far wall, past a map covered in a network of red yarn. He located the mechanism, a heavy steel pipe emerging from the concrete, fitted with a large red-painted cast-iron valve. 3 decades of corrosion had seized it. He exerted maximum force, the muscles in his neck becoming rigid, but the mechanism remained inert. Simultaneously, Lowen was beside him, her hands gripping the opposite side of the wheel. She intuitively knew the correct direction, counterclockwise. On a count of 3, they applied synchronized force, his strength and her focus acting as a single unit against the fused metal. A moment of intense strain ended with a sharp report as an old seal fractured. Rust particles flaked away as the wheel began to rotate with a low-frequency groan. The wall section behind the map hissed and retracted, revealing a pressure-sealed hatch that opened onto an absolute, primeval darkness. The scent of subterranean dampness inundated the chamber, a raw composite of organic decay and wet mineral deposits. A tunnel, hewn from bedrock and fortified with steel supports, extended before them. It was a testament to Henry's hyper-vigilant mindset, a prepared egress route from a sealed tomb. Griffin's light illuminated a passage barely wide enough for a single individual. He and Lowen exchanged a look of tacit understanding. She entered first. He followed her into the Earth's cold interior. Griffin's light cast their enlarged, distorted silhouettes onto the moisture-beaded walls. The atmosphere was stale and dense, requiring deliberate respiration. Above, support structures audibly strained under the immense pressure. Lowen lost her footing, ensnared by a root, and fell forward. Griffin's arm extended reflexively, arresting her fall and pulling her upright in a single fluid movement. He maintained his grip on her hand. The first instance of physical contact not dictated by tactical necessity, but by a mutual affirmation of their survival. Their hands remained joined in the oppressive dark. When Griffin spoke, his voice was altered, devoid of its typical detached authority, and tinged with vulnerability dormant for 20 years. Thank you for not abandoning the operation. Lowen maintained her pace. Her response was a firm, reassuring pressure from her hand, her voice steady in the blackness. Do not expire on me, Calloway. You have an outstanding debt to settle. The tunnel floor began to incline, the composition shifting from soil to viscous mud as the air quality improved. The confined, telluric odor was displaced by the smell of rain on open ground, the sensory input of liberation. Griffin looked up to a large, reinforced stone slab serving as the ceiling, designed to mimic the carriage house floor. Its release was integrated into a steel housing. Releasing Lowen, he placed his palms against the decaying wood and pushed upward. The slab pivoted on counterweights with a deep metallic protest, shedding years of accumulated debris. A blast of cold, rain-washed air flooded the tunnel in a sudden, shocking influx. He vaulted out of the opening, using the edge for leverage before assisting Lowen. They fell onto the saturated grass, rain matting their hair to their skin as they took in deep breaths. For several moments, they were motionless, absorbing the stimulus of the open sky. Pushing himself up, Griffin assessed their location. They were inside the shell of a carriage house on the perimeter of the Thornfield property. 3 stone walls stood, but the roof was missing, and the interior was overgrown to a degree that would preclude any suspicion of what lay beneath. A muddy path led from the structure toward the estate's main gate, where his vehicle was located hundreds of yards away in the storm. Griffin did not run. He retrieved his phone, its screen wet with rain, and dialed the single number he knew would be answered, even at 3 a.m. during a hurricane. Keats McGrath responded on the second ring. He made no inquiries about the situation. He simply waited. Through 20 years of association, Keats understood that a call at this hour meant questions were a liability. Thornfield House, Hudson Valley. I require 12 operatives, full tactical loadout. Listen carefully. Warren Ashford is on site with 4 of his personnel, including Bones. Griffin paused for effect. Perry has defected. I need them viable, Keats. All of them. Viable and prepared for interrogation. A moment of clear surprise registered over the line before Keats, the consummate professional, suppressed it. ETA 45 minutes, he stated, and the connection terminated. Stowing the phone, Griffin returned to the carriage house. Lowen was against a wall, saturated, a $40 million briefcase covered in mud beside them. The contents were untouched, vacuum-sealed by a man deceased for 3 decades. In the darkness, they maintained their position. The only stimuli were the percussive sound of rain and the rhythm of their respiration. Griffin's voice cut through the downpour, not from a desire for conversation, but because a 30-year-old psychological control mechanism had failed. The bunker had been the trigger. I was 6, he began, when my grandfather and I were photographed at Thornfield's gate. His inscription read, "This empire is built on blood, not currency. Protect it." It was our final photograph. He died 3 months later. The silence returned, filled by the storm. Cardiac arrest was the official cause of death. My father, the entire family unit, they accepted this narrative. I did not. I had a deep-seated, intuitive rejection of the story. But a 6-year-old's intuition is dismissed, and an adult's fabrication goes unchallenged. I have harbored this cognitive dissonance for 3 decades. His gaze fixed on the mansion, a dark shape against the turbulent sky. Tonight, I confirmed the truth. My grandfather was assassinated via poison. He knew his end was imminent. He did not flee. He constructed a tomb for his perpetrators, concealing the evidence where only I might eventually locate it. He anticipated my arrival, a 30-year projection of confidence placed in me. This evening represents the first clinical validation of that belief. A micro fissure in his vocal tone manifested on the final syllable. Lowen detected it. She remained inert for a calculated pause. Her subsequent speech was a subvocal utterance aimed at the environment, not the subject. My mother was diagnosed with pulmonary carcinoma, stage 3 upon discovery. I ceased my studies at Columbia for her care. 14 months. 14 months of attempted sleep in clinical seating, subsisting on automated provisions, conditioned by the ventilator's cadence. Rhythmic stimuli remain a trigger. She contracted her posture further. On the final night my mother had lost vocal function. The apparatus provided respiration, but she initiated a single pressure signal with my hand before cessation. She exhibited no lacrimation. Her composure was aberrant, a calm scene in subjects depleted of tear production long ago. Post-mortem, all assets were liquidated. The savings, the residence, my tuition, consumed by medical expenditures. I do not disseminate this data. It is not solicited, and vocalization provides no therapeutic remedy. A vacuum descended. A crime syndicate chief and a disenfranchised woman, contained within a ruin during a storm, with a case of $40 million between them. Neither subject observed it. The currency had become a null object. For the first time, their respective traumas were not isolated burdens. There were no platitudes, no condolences, or time heals. They co-inhabited the negative space, allowing proximity to achieve what verbal intervention could not. After 40 minutes, light beams penetrated the downpour. 3 black sport utility vehicles navigated the saturated path. A large, red-bearded operative, Keats McGrath, emerged, his 11 armed assets deploying in a standard formation. Griffin met him, issued a series of low-frequency commands, and in under 10 minutes, Thornfield House was under complete environmental control. They located Warren, Bones, Perry, and the 2 contractors precisely as Griffin's intelligence indicated. Contained in a stone passage between 2 sealed barriers, their aggression phase replaced by acute situational helplessness. Keats's unit transferred them to the main level, compelling a kneeling posture with hands secured behind their necks. Griffin entered the large sitting room, a space defined by dust-shrouded artifacts, halting before Warren Ashford. The elder subject remained kneeling, his attire compromised, yet his gaze held a cold defiance. Griffin observed him with profound stillness, exhibiting the effective calm of an individual post-trauma. 30 years prior, your father administered a poison to my grandfather, Griffin stated, his tone as neutral as a weather report. Digitalis, in microdoses, over months. He engineered a homicide to present as natural decline, which went unchallenged. You then constructed your enterprise upon my family's liquidated assets. You presumed that history was interred with him. Griffin opened the case, extracted a compact unit containing microfiche, and displayed it to Warren. You failed to account for my grandfather's contingency planning. The medical documentation, the illicit fund transfers, the falsified contracts, the dam report. It is all archived here. The primary source material, everything federal authorities require to dismantle Ashford and Crane Holdings within 48 hours. Warren's focus locked on the case, and for the first time, the rigid control in his expression began to fracture. Griffin did not transfer the evidence. He secured the microfiche in his private repository in Manhattan, then dispatched 3 copies within 24 hours. The first was delivered to the FBI's Financial Crimes Division with an anonymous document detailing the entire schema. The second arrived at the investigative unit of the New York Times, prepared for a high-impact media release. The third copy was transmitted to Orla Finch, Griffin's legal counsel, with a single directive. If any adverse event befell Griffin Calloway, disappearance, an accident, or sudden death, Orla was to disseminate the complete file to all media and law enforcement agencies on the East Coast within 1 hour. This was not a pursuit of justice. It was an exhibition of overwhelming force. He did not have them detained that night. He allowed the data to propagate, granting them 48 hours to experience anticipatory dread, forcing them to witness their empire's collapse before the state intervened. Federal agents executed a raid on the Ashford and Crane facilities in Poughkeepsie on a Tuesday morning, seizing servers, drives, and 43 containers of documents. 11 executives were removed from the premises in restraints. Warren Ashford was apprehended at his residence that morning. He was attired in a silk robe, holding coffee, his expression a complete blank as 6 armored federal agents occupied his lawn. Bones was captured 2 hours later in a low-cost motel, attempting to sanitize his mobile device. The list of charges was extensive: conspiracy to commit murder, extortion, money laundering, 30 years of racketeering, and public endangerment via the Dam Project. The media response was immediate. The Hudson Valley's most esteemed real estate conglomerate was recontextualized as a criminal organization overnight. Griffin, meanwhile, was not observing the media coverage. On the night of Warren's capture, he occupied a discreet Italian restaurant in the West Village, an establishment lacking signage, identified only by candlelight and the aroma of basil. Griffin had Keats deliver the collaborator to him via a rear entrance. This was not a meeting, it was a final assessment. Perry Langston was positioned opposite him, spine erect, hands on the table, maintaining direct eye contact with Griffin. He made no attempt to flee. He presented no rationalizations. He understood that in their operational sphere, evasion and justification were equally futile. Griffin consumed his meal with methodical pacing, like a subject with unlimited time. He drank some wine, placed the glass down, and finally engaged Perry's gaze. And Perry, an individual who had not broken visual contact with an adversary in 18 years, was the first to divert his eyes. "Do you want to know my primary source of aversion, Perry?" Griffin inquired, his voice level. "It is not the betrayal. That is a simple variable. Desperate subjects with high stakes act predictably. What I find intolerable," he paused, manipulating his wineglass, "is that you genuinely believed your actions would go undetected. For 18 years, I instructed you in this methodology, and you still misjudged me so fundamentally. That is the true transgression." Griffin would not expend a projectile on Perry. A bullet would be a form of release. Instead, as Perry consumed his final meal, Griffin commenced his systematic deconstruction. Before Perry exited the building, his existence had been nullified. His financial accounts were frozen. His encrypted device was rendered inert. The Brooklyn apartment Griffin owned was already being sanitized by a disposal team. The concluding action was a broadcast to every operative from Boston to Miami. "Perry Langston is no longer a recognized entity. Assisting him is an act of aggression against me. In their system, to be terminated implied prior significance. But to be erased from the operational ledger, to have every access point sealed, to become an unrecognized ghost among system participants, that is a state worse than termination." Perry Langston exited that restaurant and was removed from the criminal topography of the East Coast. 1 month later, the Hudson Valley displayed peak autumn foliage. The neglected path to Thornfield House was now a smooth access road, bordered by mature oaks, shedding leaves of red and gold, as if deploying a new surface for a seasonal transition. And at the lane's terminus, the mansion was no longer a derelict structure. It was undergoing a profound reconstruction. A steel lattice covered the east wing, where crews were installing new stone and repairing the roof. The sealed windows were gone, replaced by new oak frames and glass that absorbed sunlight for the first time in 30 years. Even the main doors, once damaged by Warren Ashford, were now perfect facsimiles, their brass hardware polished. And overseeing this symphony of renewal, gesturing to schematics, was Lowen Price. Yet this was not the same subject Griffin had discovered on the second floor. The acuity in her eyes remained, but her posture now conveyed a new form of authority. It was not defiance, but the quiet control of a person who understands their environmental fit. Griffin had assigned her the entire Thornfield project, a studio, and arranged for her to complete her Columbia degree that spring. Her tuition was funded by the Henry Callaway Scholarship, an endowment for architecture students Griffin established in his grandfather's name. To Griffin, a legacy was never about social standing. It is the principle that valuable assets are never forgotten. Griffin's single SUV arrived. He disembarked, his standard vehicle escort absent, and simply absorbed the visual data. With hands in his pockets, he observed the sun reflecting off the steel. For the first time, this location was not a tomb. It was reawakening. Lowen observed him, concluded her discussion with her foreman, and traversed the grounds. A fine dust of plaster in her hair, blueprints under her arm, her boots covered in mud. She stopped beside him, her gaze mirroring his. "The roof is 2 weeks from being sealed," she reported, her tone professional, but with an undercurrent of accomplishment. "The Great Hall requires another 3 months. We are removing all outdated wiring and plumbing, but the study—" She pivoted, a minimal smile forming. "I retained the hammer impact mark. I instructed the painters to preserve it. It is a testament." He met her gaze, and in the subsequent silence, no verbal communication was required. They understood that the scar was not mere damage. It was the fracture through which a secret suppressed for 30 years could finally be exposed. Griffin produced the monochromatic artifact from his coat. Henry Callaway with the subject, then aged 6, on these exact coordinates. He moved to the study, directly to a trauma point in the wall, a deep gouge resembling a wound, and placed the photograph on the newly installed sill. It was oriented toward the light. "The psychological void is now filled, grandfather," Griffin vocalized, a low-frequency utterance intended for the environment itself. "The house has its primary operator." Lowen observed from the threshold, respecting the therapeutic moment. He then redirected his focus to her, and the East Coast's most dominant male subject displayed a genuine smile. This expression was not the performative smile of a sociopathic leader. It was indicative of a subject who had achieved a state of psychological resolution that $40 million and a criminal organization could not procure: homeostasis. Lowen approached the window. She placed her hand over his in a nonverbal gesture of co-regulation. This was the same tactile intervention she employed in the bunker during his acute systemic breakdown. Here, however, his psychological state was not fracturing, it was undergoing integration. They remained in place, observing the environment. The foliage displayed peak seasonal coloration, and Thornfield House exhibited auditory signs of life. The case study of Griffin and Lowen is fundamentally an analysis of psychological barriers. The physical barrier Henry constructed out of paranoia, the emotional fortress Griffin erected as a defense mechanism, and the 6-year socioeconomic confinement of Lowen. The dissolution of each was a prerequisite for their psychological liberation. The most valued psychic assets are not secured by external locks. They are often accessed only when one deconstructs their own internal prisons, confronts a core trauma, and allows a new attachment figure into a life structured for isolation. If this case analysis has elicited an effective response, your feedback is clinically valuable. Which element of the psychodrama resonated most profoundly? Have you ever had to dismantle a personal psychological construct of fear, grief, or past trauma to achieve a breakthrough? You are invited to submit your own case notes, the comments. I review every entry. your data contributes to a broader understanding. A positive rating helps this analysis reach others. Transmit it to a contact who might benefit from this psychological model today. To follow this ongoing research, subscribe. To all observers, I wish you a state of psychological equilibrium, a baseline of contentment, and a significant measure of internal peace. Thank you for your attention to the conclusion of this file. The analysis is now complete. I will present our next case study shortly.